It's certainly an honor to be here and to get this opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing over the last 12 years, centered around the psychological concept of hope in the context of adversity and trauma. Um, I'm going to share my PowerPoint in just a few moments. And as Professor Latham said, I'm going to ask you to engage by using the chat function. I'll give you a little bit of a heads up a couple of times where I'm going to ask you to do that. And so with that, I will start sharing my slide and get set up here. Okay. So as mentioned, I'm a professor here at the University of Oklahoma at the Tulsa campus, and I run the Hope Research Center, which is an organization that partners with community service agencies, primarily conducting outcomes assessments and needs assessments for our community. Primarily in nonprofits. Most of my work has been in domestic violence, child maltreatment, homelessness, and extreme poverty. I'm a quantitative psychologist by training. That is, my PhD is in the areas of statistics, research methods, and the philosophy of science. So I'm going to give a bit of a presentation that is not overly academic in terms of the science with regards to statistics, but the presentation is going to summarize about 12 years of research in that context. 12 years ago, I was conducting a housing needs assessment for an organization here in Tulsa. And as part of designing that outcome assessment, I was doing some pretty informal interviews and conversations with clients of that organization. And I was introduced to a young man named David. And David introduced me to this concept of hope. I had about a 10-minute conversation with this young man. And that 10-minute conversation changed my life both personally and professionally. So I always like to start this presentation by giving a little bit of honor to him. In the conversation that I had with this young man, he was 19 years old, as I think I mentioned. And as I was talking with David, what I learned was that 3 months prior, he had learned that he was HIV positive. And as a psychologist in that training of psychology, I was immediately driven by this question, that is, trying to understand this idea of what is wrong with you. So when David presented to me the adversity that he was experiencing, I was immediately drawn to begin to look for those signs of adversity, that is, depression, anxiety, etc. Interestingly enough, David did not display any of that that I was looking for, at least in that moment. As he and I continued the conversation, he further shared with me that as he had disclosed to his parents that he was HIV positive 2 weeks prior, they had kicked him out of the house and he had spent the last 2 weeks homeless in downtown Tulsa. So again, as he shares with me this adversity, I'm immediately drawn to and driven by this question of what's wrong with you. In that moment, David began to share with me his ideas about the future. He was going to enroll in Tulsa Community College. He knew what his major was going to be. He had an appointment with an academic counselor. He had not only a future idea, but he had a plan. And in that brief conversation with David, it really struck me in that moment that I had spent my entire career research and in the work out of the Hope Research Center focused on this idea of what is wrong with you. And I realized in that moment that maybe one of the questions I should have also asked was this idea of what is right with you. What are the strengths that individuals possess that can help them not just overcome adversity, but to live life well? And so As this work and this interest of hope of mine has emerged, I began to become very interested in the experience of trauma, and primarily through the adversities of the adverse childhood experiences, which is a very common framework for studying adversity during childhood. Um, but in the state of Oklahoma and other states that I work with, state of Washington, California, and others, the ACEs framework is really shifting the question professionally from this idea that is driven by what's wrong with you to a more trauma-informed approach of what's happened to you, or trauma-aware approach. Now, I'm not going to spend much time going over ACEs, but I do want to sort of ground and contextualize the study of hope and my interest of hope in this idea of trauma. So the adverse childhood experiences is based upon this idea that before the age of 18, um, if any one or more of these events occurred during your childhood, so for instance, if you experienced physical abuse, you would give yourself a score of a 1. If you did not experience that, then you give yourself a score of a 0. Add all of those up, and adverse childhood experiences scores range from a 0, no events, to 10, where you've experienced all of these. So just to further consider this, the Center for Disease Control does a periodic scan, nationally representative studies in the United States. And this is from the 2016 scan that they ran of about, if I remember correctly, about 70,000 adults in the United States. And just a few key takeaways. Number one is that about 36% of the adult population has an ACE score of 0. The clear takeaway from this in the context of ACE is that about 2/3 of the adult population in the United States has an ACE score of 1 or higher. So the idea that these adverse childhood experiences are in fact prevalent in our communities. And further, the research on ACEs highlights this idea of a dosage effect or cumulative effect. That is, the more adversities that you accumulate in your life, especially during the childhood, the more prevalent or pronounced the long-term adversities that you experience across the lifespan, risk types of behaviors plus physical, psychological, and social difficulties across the lifespan. As you can see, the idea that about 12 or 13% of the adult population has an ACE score of 4 or higher, with an average ACE score of a 1.61. I say that to really kind of contextualize in the context of the work that I've been doing and that's been taking place at the Hope Research Center. So again, the national data suggest an average score of 1.61. So I am fortunate enough to be able to study children exposed to domestic violence across 22 states, tracking them once a year throughout childhood. And the group of about 380 that we're currently tracking across long-term, their average ACE score is a 4. By the way, the average age of this group is 11 years old. So children exposed to domestic violence aren't just exposed to domestic violence. In fact, more often than not, they're poly victims in that context. Juvenile offenders also tend to have a high history of childhood trauma. And I'm going to ask you to use the chat function because at the Hope Research Center, we're fortunate enough to work with the state of Oklahoma in our foster youth program. And in particular, we have just finished data collection for foster youth who are aging out of our system here in the state of Oklahoma. And just using the chat function, what I would ask you is, what would be your guess at the average number of placements for foster youth between the ages of 14 and 17? Just type in the chat function if you don't mind. 20, good. Good, thank you. Suzanne? Any other guesses on what the average number of placements might be? So 10, yeah, thank you. So for the data that we collected, it's 15. 15 is the average number of placements. So every time a child is moved from home to home, we have to consider the adversity. In this age group of individuals, we have a 16-year-old young man who has 58 placements currently. And so what I wanted to highlight was just that the adverse childhood experiences, though pronounced and well recognized in the academic literature, um, is very limited in terms of the types of adversities that are captured. It does not capture, for instance, community violence or historic trauma or racism, immigration, human trafficking, elder abuse, strangulation, etc. Other adversities that we know. Um, and so this awareness of trauma, this awareness of the adverse childhood experiences, again, in the areas that I work, has really put forward this idea of trauma-informed care. And in that context, as individuals become more and more aware of these effects of trauma and adversity, we're driven to the question of how do we respond to that? How do we as an organization, how do we as a community, how do we as a state begin to respond to these prevalent adversities that are existing in our communities? And so what I would like to talk about this evening in this time is that I believe that hope is what we do about that, that we take a very intentional framework of integrating the science of hope into a larger scale systemic response. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat function here. And what I would ask is that as you consider this idea of hope, just in your own mind, as you think about the word hope, what comes to mind? What does hope reflect for you? So just use the chat function again. The future, thank you. Future, very good. Possibility, inspiration, thank you. Thank you. Any more? Good. Looking forward to things improving. Good. Good. Resilience. Good. I hope we get a chance to talk about that. Positive thinking, peace. Good. Wonderful. Wonderful responses. Forgiveness. I like that. So as you continue to type those in, let me ask you a follow-up question. Is hope is it an emotion? Is it a feeling? Or is hope a thought process, a way of thinking? So what are your thoughts on that? Is it a feeling? Is it an emotion? Or is it a cognition? So great. Feeling, all of those. So let's just go ahead and assume that I'm a very nurturing professor and recognize that I didn't give you the option of both as a response. So let's just say if you were going to lean one way or the other, is it a feeling or a cognition? So go ahead and make a stand, if you will, of where you think that might be. Good, good. So it's kind of both. I'm seeing both feeling, both emotion, both cognition. So, and what I'll tell you is that some researchers actually incorporate hope as a feeling. We believe in the theoretical framework that we use from Professor Snyder out of the University of Kansas, is that hope is a cognitive process. Hope is a way of thinking. And the reason that that's so important in the work that I do, in the communities that I work, is because hope is a way of thinking. It is something that can be taught. So the simplistic definition that we use is hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that you have the power to make it so. Excuse me. Now, what's important about this definition, that hope is the belief that your future will be better than today, is that if we stopped right there in that definition, hope would be very similar to this idea of optimism, this future expectation that things will turn out okay. It's the latter part of the definition that distinguishes hope from optimism, and that is that you have the power to make it so. Now, in our research, what we're really interested in is how does the experience of trauma, adversity, stress, how does that influence our belief that we have some control over pursuing that future? So, hope is a very simple concept grounded in three simple ideas. First is this recognition that goals are the cornerstone of our ability to hope, that each and every one of us are goal driven. The question becomes whether or not we have the ability to identify and to conceptualize the pathways or the strategies by which to pursue those goals. So, pathways thinking is the planning process of how we're going to get there from here. Pathways thinking also includes our ability to understand the barriers that we may be experiencing and to begin the problem solving process around those obstacles. So that is considered pathways thinking. The final component is referred to agency, to be agentic. My work in the community, I prefer to use the word willpower. And the reason I prefer to use willpower is that when I'm working with a nonprofit agency, and I use the word agency, they oftentimes will think of their organization. So it's a little less confusing in that context. But the psychological term to be agentic is just this mental energy that we have to dedicate towards those pathway pursuits. It is the motivational piece of hope. Goals, pathways, willpower. So what we've been studying is how does again, this trauma, this adversity, uncertainty, stress, how do all of those things influence the goals that we set? And so here's just a couple of things that we've learned. First of all, is that individuals with a higher history of trauma, individuals who score lower on hope, as well as individuals who are experiencing adversity and stress, are more likely to set avoidant oriented goals. So they're more likely to set goals of things that they don't want to occur. And then on the other end, higher hope individuals, individuals who score higher on hope, are much more likely to set achievement oriented goals. The other thing that we found is that lower hope individuals are more likely to set short-term goals. They're much better at thinking about short-term compared to this long-term idea of thinking. Now, how that plays out is a personal example for me. So I was homeless throughout most of my high school years. And in that process, when I graduated high school, the principal in a very small rural community, the principal asked us to announce in a school assembly what our goals for the future might be. And as the principal was asking that question, I remember very distinctly, number one, I was losing my safe place. That school for me was a place that I knew that I could be safe for a good part of the day. It was also the space where I could get a meal. It was also a place that I could take a shower. And so as I began to consider what my goals for the future were, I began to consider the idea of working on a farm, working at a local prison, joining the military, or going to college. Now, when it came my turn, I announced that I was going to college. But what you have to recognize is that I didn't choose going to college to achieve a college degree. What I did was choose going to college as a way to avoid the other options. Now, how that turned out was my first semester grade point average is a 0.56. So I'll kind of pause there to let that sink in. So 0.56, which means I failed every course but one. But because I had an avoidant goal, it influences the pathways thinking. That is, things like going to class and studying for exams were not pathways that I considered for my goals. And so the way in which we set those goals influences our pathways thinking. Another thing that we've learned is that, and this is especially true with children, is that individuals with a higher trauma background um, oftentimes have difficulties with the planning process, this idea of being able to identify the mental roadmaps to goal attainment. So children exist in a fairly limited control of their environment anyway, but when you throw into the mix abuse and neglect and other forms of adversity, their ability to predict their environment goes away as well. So it influences their pathways process. And then finally, a couple of things that I want to highlight with regards to willpower or this agency idea is that our willpower is actually limited throughout the day. That is, our willpower is being depleted throughout the day. We only have so much mental energy that we can dedicate to our pathway pursuit. So that's a very important thing to remember. There's a line of research out of Florida State University showing that glucose in our blood, glucose in our brain actually, is highly correlated to our willpower. So what happens when our willpower becomes depleted is we begin to lose the capacity for self-regulation, our ability to self-regulate our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors. We're less likely to be able to control an emotional outburst. Um, we might become much more impulsive, for instance, as we lose that willpower component. Now, I'm going to ask you to use the chat function again in just a moment, but it's important to recognize that when we're talking about hope, that you have to have both pathways and willpower to be considered hopeful. That is, you have to have not only the motivation towards the goal, but you also have to have the pathways piece. So if I'm highly motivated to achieve a particular goal, but I don't know how to get there from here, I don't have pathways, this is what we would consider to be lower in hope. Even though I look and I'm energetic, the fact that I don't know how to get there reduces my hope. The alternative is that I have the pathways to achieve the goal. I'm just not motivated to do that work. I'm not motivated to do the pathways or the strategies by which to attain that goal. So again, lower in hope. So using the chat function, what I'd like for you to do is think about all of the ways that you use the word hope every day in your language. Think about just sort of common usage of hope and just put it in the chat function. Just our common everyday use of the word. Hope you have a good day. Thank you. Judy. I hope I hope you're doing well. Good. I hope it doesn't rain. Hope you're doing well. Hope you have a great day. And it's important here because we more oftentimes use the word hope when in fact we really mean or are referring to a wish. So in the hope work, we distinguish wishing from hoping in this idea of the pathways component. So when we're highly um, um, motivated, we have a lot of willpower towards a particular goal, but don't have the pathways, we actually refer to that as wishing. So in the context of goals, wishing becomes passive, whereas hope is about taking action to pursue that future. So goals, pathways, and willpower. Now, in this context of hope from Rick Snyder out of the University of Kansas, who passed away in 2006, Shane Lopez out of Gallup followed that work, a few other researchers. But there's approximately 2,000 published research studies in this context across medicine, psychology, mental health, a whole host of disciplines. And all of this research tends to point towards a fairly common set of findings. First of all, is for both children and adults, our ability to hope is a very strong predictor of our well-being, our capacity to flourish. Within education, the research points to the idea that a child's hope scores can be predictive of things like attendance, grades, graduation rates, college going rates. And there's about 4 published studies now that show that a child's hope scores are actually a better predictor of first year college performance than the ACT, SAT, or high school GPA. By the way, all controlling for things like personality, IQ, and social economic status. This work also has profound outcomes in health with regards to pain tolerance, responding to treatment. We conducted a study in Tulsa a couple of years ago called How Hopeful is Tulsa? We captured data from about 1,000 participants across the city. And then we were able to geocode the data, that is to get the data to a place. And we did that both at the zip code level as well as the council district level. And interestingly enough, getting access to other data sets, what we found is that individuals' hope scores were actually highly correlated to voter turnout, as well as life expectancy from the public health data. So hope scores also tend to be associated with indicators of citizenship and social action like volunteerism. So again, I'm going to ask you to use the chat function. And in this context of hope, from my perspective, this is one of the most important slides that talk about some of the main guiding principles of our ability to hope. And so what I'd like for you to do is just to, in the chat function, just indicate whether or not you know how to drive or have attempted to drive a stick shift or a manual transmission vehicle. So just yes or no in the chat function. Great, great. That's what I love about Oklahoma. We tend to get a lot of those. Great, great. Wonderful. So here's what I'd like for us to think about. So let's set up a scenario. And in this scenario, and Cooper, it's okay feeling left out. It's okay. You can still be a part of this. So let's take this scenario from the idea that our desired goal is that we want to drive, and that the only pathway that we have available to us is that we want to drive a stick shift car. So if we're going to drive, we're going to have to navigate that process. So the first thing that I would do, and Cooper, I may just ask you, for instance, in your own mind, can you imagine yourself sitting in a driver's seat of a car with a manual transmission? And as you picture yourself in that scenario, can you see the pedals on the floor, the clutch, the brake, and the gas pedal? And sort of imagine the gear shift beside you. And then can you imagine yourself driving that stick shift car? And so this is the first big important piece about beginning to nurture this idea of hope. And that is, imagination becomes the instrument of hope. Our ability to imagine ourselves pursuing that future becomes an important first step. So for the rest of us, let's remember that very first attempt that we had to drive that stick shift car. And what I'd like for you to do is just embrace the memory of the anxiety, the fear, the excitement, all of that emotion that was going on in that very first attempt. And in this hypothetical example, let's say that we're going to drive this car, attempt to drive this car the very first time. And let's say that we're at a slight uphill incline and there's a brand new, let's say, Lexus parked right behind us. So we've got the car started. We've got the clutch depressed. We're in first gear. Now, what I'd like for you to do is just use the chat function. So as we're about to let the clutch out for the very first time, and we've got this Lexus behind us, we're a little bit of an uphill climb. As we're letting that clutch out that very first time, what is our goal in that moment? So just use the chat function if you don't mind. Not to stall, not to hit the car. What I want to highlight, and this is the very common response that I get, if you'll notice in the chat function, what I want to point out is that all of those are avoidant goals. When we are in a stressful situation, anxiety producing situation, we are much more likely to begin to thinking from an avoidant framework. So as we let that clutch out, let's remember the fact that we actually did stall and kill the car. That it just, let's say we didn't hit the car behind us, but we stalled the car. And in that moment of failure, what I want us to think about is, what is our self-talk? And oftentimes the self-talk is, I can't do this. I'll never be able to do this. This is what we're finding with lower hope children in particular, is this self-talk filled with the I can'ts. Now, what I'd ask you to consider is, for those of you who do know how to drive the stick shift car, is to consider why you didn't give up. Why did you not give up in that moment of failure? And oftentimes the reason is because we desire the goal. I want to drive. If I'm going to drive, I have to navigate this pathway. So the important takeaway is that the more we desire the outcome, the more we desire the goal, the more likely we're going to face adversity to try to overcome it. We're going to continue to persevere, to endure during this adversity. So we start the car back up in this hypothetical example. We start the car back up, we let the clutch out, and this time we lurch forward, but we're driving, we're successful. So we've had a successful attempt. So we're going to stop the car again, because practice makes perfect. And so we start it again. And as we let the clutch out, this third time we stall the car. But what I want you to think about is, what is the change in our self-talk? Because I had that moment of success earlier, my self-talk has changed from I can't to the idea that, well, I've done this before, I can do this again. And here's the importance of nurturing hope, especially in times of adversity, is because we had this opportunity for success, it demonstrated for us that the future is possible. And this idea of driving a stick shift car is an example that highlights the idea that there's nobody else who's doing this. This is all you. The future is going to be better than today, and you have the power to make it so. So this is the pathways component of hope. The question becomes, how well can you manage your willpower? And so what you'll recognize is that when you think about your willpower from this idea of focusing our attention, then the very first few times we let that clutch out, we have to be able to dedicate all of our attention to that process. Whereas today, it doesn't require much of our attention at all. Now, what's important, though, in the context of the work that I do with many nonprofit human service agencies, is that their programs are, in fact, their organizations are, in fact, pathways of hope for the individuals being served. So the domestic violence agencies, the shelters, these are all pathways of hope for survivors. But in order to navigate that process, those survivors have to be able to dedicate all of that willpower, all of that attention to those early first steps. Meanwhile, the rest of life is going on. We have to remember that willpower is limited, and that the rest of life that's going on is also demanding our attention. And then ultimately, what we know is that when an individual triggers or experiences trauma, their attention goes into chaos, or it can go into chaos, making this process almost untenable. So what I'd like for you to do is just close your eyes for just a second, and I'm going to start going through the slides fairly quickly so we can make sure we get done in time for some conversation. But just close your eyes for a moment, get relaxed, and I'm going to ask you just to let your mind wander wherever it will go. And I'll bring us back in just a few seconds. Just let your mind wander. Okay, so as you were letting your mind wander, what I would ask you is, where did your mind go? Did it go to this future, this idea of what is going to happen? What are things that are going to happen to you this evening, or things that you're thinking about in the future? Or did you reflect upon the past? Just use the chat function if you don't mind, just real quickly. Were you future oriented? Were you past? Were you both? Um, some of you may have been actually present, which is actually a little bit more rare. Um, and yeah, so as you can see from the chat function, and this attention control theory, our ability to focus our attention, this willpower, what we know is that most of us tend to be thinking about the future and a little less frequently the past, and rarely are we, in fact, present. Most of us are future oriented. However, in this work, the research we've been doing for the last couple of years has been focused on the idea that when we think about the future or the past and consider what's going on right now in our nation, right? We're thinking about the future, and many of us are thinking about the future from this perspective of worry and fear, right? But what we've also learned is that higher levels of trauma sort of increase our propensity to be ruminating on the past, to be thinking about regret, guilt, and shame. And what happens when individuals spend most of their time in worry or rumination, they also score much higher on areas of suffering. So, this work that we're interested in is how do we begin to interrupt this negative attention control so that individuals have the capacity to hope? Because we know that as they increase their ability to hope, so too is their opportunity for flourishing. So I always ask this question every presentation I give all over the States and when I was able to travel to Europe and other places. But let me ask you this, just using the chat function. What is the opposite of hope? What is the opposite of hope? Despair. Thank you. So this is the most common response. And in this hope theory that I'm talking about, you'll just have to trust me that that I am in fact a nurturing professor at OU, but in fact you're wrong. It is not despair. The opposite of hope is actually this idea of apathy. Apathy is when I look at the future goal that I have and I recognize that no matter what I do, I'm going to fail. There's nothing I can do to change that. So it's this idea of giving up. I just don't care anymore. It's a loss of motivation. Despair, interestingly enough, is still a small part of hope. And that is we have this willpower towards the goal. It's just that our pathways are significantly blocked. So, what we're interested in is this idea of despair. And in despair, we begin to experience urgency, a sense of urgency. And what I'd like for you to think about is that despair leads to desperation. And oftentimes in desperation, we look for or find pathways that can be dysfunctional, not only to ourselves, but to those around us. So, desperate types of behaviors. And so, here is just a real quick relationship between hope and depression among high school aged youth. The state of Washington, we have an agreement with them to collect data. I think it's roughly about 40,000 youth in the state of Washington in their Healthy Youth Survey. And we're able to classify youth into high hope, moderate hope, slight hope, no hope. And then you can see that, for instance, the no and low hope group and the slightly hopeful group of kids, about 60 to 70% of them also report depression. Same results for anxiety, loneliness, etc. And a very similar pattern that you see for suicidal ideation. So again, hope has significant association with our well-being indicators. What we've been focused on in this research is how do we turn the needle? How do program services begin to restore and nurture hope with individuals and families experiencing despair and, in fact, apathy? So we know how to do this process. We've built curriculum and tested this curriculum, working with many agencies in the state of Oklahoma and others. We have a current project statewide with the Oklahoma Department of Human Services to become a hope-centered state agency. So we're training all 6,500 employees integrating it into their program services using this process. We know how to nurture hope. And just as a real quick example, thinking about nurturing hope for a high trauma group of youth, this is the 380 children exposed to domestic violence. These are the various ACE indicators. And you can see pretty high prevalence of various types of adversity: domestic violence, incarcerated parent, verbal abuse, emotional neglect, etc. So we actually train 18, 19, and 20-year-old camp counselors. This is a 1-week intervention. It is non-therapeutic. It is a challenge by choice camp that integrates the science of hope into the curriculum of goal setting and pathways development. We measure hope 30 days before the intervention, the last day of the intervention, and a 30-day follow-up. And so what we see is a significant increase in the child's hope scores across time. This is very consistent across 22 states. What I do want to point out is that in our work of hope, hope is not the outcome. The outcome is, what does this change in hope scores actually predict? And what the research shows is that a 2-point increase in a child's hope scores has the predictive power of a letter grade change in the classroom. We took 100 of these kids and tracked them for a year and saw that these changes in hope were actually predictive of grades at the end of the school year the following spring. We know how to do the process. We know how to nurture hope. It begins by understanding hope as goals, pathways, willpower, that it is different than wishing, that it's about action. It is grounded in the idea of goal setting and finding the pathways, including barriers and solutions, and then engaging in willpower activities. So all of this process we've studied, and we have some worksheets that we've developed for both children and adults, and we can generally show a significant increase in hope in about an hour to 2 hours of work and intervention. The question becomes whether or not we can sustain that hope. So as a closing slide, so that we can begin to maybe have a little bit of discussion, is one of my favorite sort of statements about hope. And that is that if we recognize that the heart of change is your ability or my ability to understand that the way things are right now in my life, and that I can begin to imagine the way that things could be. So for me, this is when hope is born. This is where hope is restored, is when we can begin to imagine a future that is different than today. So that's a summary of our work. I will stop sharing my screen and see if there are any interest in Q&A. And I guess I should start that off by saying that I teach statistics to social work students, so I am completely comfortable with silence.
That's good. This is an inevitably quiet medium, unfortunately. When you finish speaking, you may not hear it, and I know you're relatively close to Broken Arrow, but there is applause that's happening. I think I can faintly detect it out my windows here. So I'm grateful for this, Chan. That was a terrific talk, really informative, really inspiring, I think, and certainly has raised a number of questions for me. So I want to pause and just urge everyone in the chat, as I said, please post your questions there. We have some people that are also monitoring the chat, and will help consolidate some of those questions and monitor them and make sure they get through. But I'm going to try to serve as best I can as a moderator here for some of these questions as well. So, and it looks like we have a couple in here, so I'll go ahead and start with some of these. So this is from Nathan. He says, hope is about action. Are happiness, joy, and euphoria similarly about action? or are those more a feeling than a cognitive process? And I think that's still a topic that's worth revisiting. Is you drew out this distinction between the two, and I still don't quite know where I'm coming down on this. But let's start with Nathan's question here about things like where hope lines up next to happiness and joy.
Sure. So in this conceptual model of hope theory as a cognitive process, we tend to think about emotion as an outcome of that process. So as I begin to experience success in my goal pursuit, then I would experience joy and happiness. As I experience barriers or failures, then I experience the emotional reaction of, anger, frustration, sadness. So we tend to think that hope is an outcome of that process of goal-directed activity. So I'm not sure that answers it wholly.
Well, but I think it can also help us take a moment here to revisit this question of the difference between an emotion, and I forget your exact term, an orientation or a mode of thinking, a habit of thinking, or cognition, I think is what you called it. I wonder if you can say a bit more about how you as a psychologist in particular understand or what is that distinction exactly that you're drawing?
Yeah, so I tend to think about it in this framework as, a cognitive process might be maybe not wholly absent of emotion. Maybe it's in part influence. If we're angry, it sort of influences the way we think about pathways or goals. There's some interesting work out there on this whole rumination area, for instance, of revenge fantasies. Being part of that, and then the emotional framework where I tend to really explore it, to be honest with you, is like when the pandemic hit, right? When pandemic first hit in March, our first reaction is driven by fear and uncertainty, and that emotional response, that emotional reaction of fear, sort of influences our coping strategies, right? So fear and despair lead to desperate behaviors such as hoarding toilet paper and hand sanitizer and social isolation, kinds of components. And so we have to try to find ways in which those issues of fear and uncertainty and despair, which can lead to pretty maladaptive strategies, can be interrupted by, again, we know that in the process of stress and adversity, focusing more on short-term goal setting than long-term goal setting can be a way to restore hope, because there are so many things that are out of our control that we begin to start focusing on what are we going to accomplish this week, and then what are the strategies to achieve, and we refer to it as a stepping process, that gear shift example, and that's how we begin to interrupt the sort of emotion-based coping strategies. So again, I'm not sure I'm fully capturing that.
No, I think that's really helpful, and I really appreciated the definition that you offered. And I know this is something we may return to here in a moment, based on some of the other questions about your definition of a wish in relationship to planning. That you need both of these elements for hope, willpower, and pathway making. And I found it then the consequent definition of wish to be there pretty interesting.
Well,
I want without having any willpower to go get it. Basically, right?
Well, and so really we have to also start to distinguish fantasy from a wish to this idea of hoping. And so in the work with these organizations responding to trauma and adversity, getting the desire to an outcome, the wish piece, getting that wish activated, can then lead to the interest of developing and identifying and exploring the pathway. So we actually move from a wish to hope by making it actionable. So
it's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's the difference between saying like I wish I were or I want to be a millionaire, right? That's my goal, right? But that's actually not really a very useful goal to have if you don't have a pathway to think about how am I going to get there.
Right.
So here's a very interesting question. This comes from Cheryl Lindell, who says she works, I think I have this right, she works with cancer patients who often get catastrophic diagnoses. And I hope I've represented this correctly, Cheryl. Forgive me if I haven't. And she asks, and this is in connection with another question here, that how do you think about hope for people who get, I'm sorry, she uses the term dramatic diagnoses in situations like that. And this is followed by a question from Jenna Lee, who asks, can you have too much hope? Is hope always a sort of thing that is it always useful to have, especially in the face perhaps of something like a cancer diagnosis?
Right. So we actually write about this a little bit in the book of Hope Rising, and it's this idea. And your campus is fortunate. You have a wonderful organization on campus called Titan, with just amazing faculty and students who are doing wonderful trauma work, and advancing that understanding. But I want to be careful to recognize that when we get devastating information, let's say like a cancer diagnosis, or a good friend of mine passed away a couple of weeks ago from COVID, who I'd known for 20 years. And so, when I get that information, I don't want to just rush up and say, hey, you just need to be hopeful, right? Let's just set a goal, find a pathway. Because what we need to do is honor that, that moment. And when you get devastating news, the experience of grief and loss and anger and frustration and fear are all healthy, natural human responses to those adversities. It's when the time is right. It's when we begin to move past that sort of survival moment that we begin to nurture and restore hope. Some of the research in cancer, spinal cord injury, other areas of some fairly devastating medical conditions show that individuals who had higher levels of hope tend to respond better to treatment, to cancer treatment. There's a wonderful book called The Anatomy of Hope that is written by an oncologist about his experience with cancer patients in the context of their levels of hope. So I'd recommend certainly that as a good read. But we know that individuals, when we begin to think about nurturing and restoring hope, it's goals for what, right? So not just in general, but goal setting that becomes very specific. So for instance, in cancer survival, it may be beginning to become very goal-oriented in nutrition as a pathway to perhaps navigating the cancer aspects of that. I have a little bit of history in that, so I certainly appreciate and understand that statement or the question associated with it. What was the other question? I'm sorry.
Well, I think it was similar to, I think you might have answered this, but it was a question of, can you have too much hope?
Yeah.
And in fact, I would also, there's a corollary here, I think, from Matt that says something like, can hope be manipulated? Should we be, there's just some skeptical questions. Should we also be cautious about hope? Yeah. And here, Matt uses a pretty dramatic example of the idea of the over Auschwitz, the famous phrase, work will set you free. Right? But his hope can be manipulated for some pretty nefarious ends, perhaps. So should we be cautious about hope, I think, and is some of what these questions are on.
Sure. Yeah, no, and I greatly appreciate that. There's actually a little bit of research that has looked at extremely high hope individuals and just sort of, how they tend to respond. We're actually just beginning the pilot of a study with batter intervention groups. And we're seeing kind of incredibly high level of hope among batters in a treatment program. So it leads us to begin to ask the question about hope for what. And so one of the things that I want us to recognize is I've been talking about hope in a very sort of broad context and from the perspective of it as a good thing. And what I do want to highlight is that this theory of hope that Snyder put forward, and I agree with, is that hope is amoral. And so as an example, if my goal is to get money for the weekend and my pathway is to go rob a bunch of cars in my neighborhood, and I'm highly motivated to do that, then I'm a hopeful individual. It's just that my pathways aren't nearly morally good. And so we've actually begun to examine what are those sort of moral drivers that help us, or the values that we have that help us choose the goals that we set, and to distinguish and determine from a variety of pathways. So that's kind of our next line of research that I'm fairly interested in. Don't know the answer to that yet, but
yeah, it's a fascinating question. As I said, as I said at the remarks, and with the election, of course, on everyone's mind, it seems like we have two very hopeful groups of people that are hoping for very different things, and I think that touches on some of this here, right?
It does, yeah.
That hope does feel sort of neutral, as you said, more. It doesn't have a morality itself, and so there's another piece clearly we need to think about here,
right?
The value of hope. And I guess I would even ask the sort of converse of this, which is, have you thought, or do you know of research or have studied questions like about skepticism, for example, which I don't think is the same thing as despair. I mean, it's not the opposite of hope, but it is a sort of alternative to hope that might be more socially constructive, right? That it's not about being pessimistic, but rather about skeptical in a rational kind of way, right? To constantly doubt can also have some positive benefits.
Clearly, from a rational perspective, it clearly does have a way that will help us sort of distinguish and probably thoughtfully consider pathways and barriers that might otherwise somebody may have just rushed into and through. So, I could see some benefits to that. And I'm glad that you distinguish that concept from, a pessimistic perspective, because, while there is some research on personality that shows fairly limited or small associations with hope, we have to recognize that things like optimism versus pessimism give us a perspective of the future that's very different. And so I don't know the answer on the skepticism, though I find myself very appreciative of that perspective, because as researchers, I do aspire to be a trained skeptic, and thus setting the hypotheses that we study as to whether or not hope is a meaningful psychological strength. And data looks pretty good, but we're testing it every time.
Yeah. Oh, that's really an interesting answer. Well, there's another sort of micro conversation that's happened here in the chat, and this is our question from Cooper, and this goes back to, I think, maybe we'll call it some skepticism about the hope hypothesis here. He says, and I'm just going to read this because it's somewhat biographical here. I grew up in Catholic school and remember being told time and again that not having hope was, as they put it, quote, the only sin that cannot be forgiven. Do you think hope can be used or distorted to create a sense of shame? That is, how can hope be manipulated? I think not just shame, I can imagine it being manipulated in all kinds of ways.
Sure, yeah. I'll tell you where I've actually heard this play out fairly recently was a conversation that I had with, after a presentation, an individual with a pretty long history of an eating disorder, and this idea of the willpower piece or the agency piece that a number of family members and others basically just had the idea that if you just wanted it bad enough, you could do it. If you just had enough motivation or willpower, you could achieve those goals. And so we are a little bit careful about using hope in the context of some aspect of shaming. It's why I pointed out in the stick shift car that it has to be, and when I do the trainings, it has to be your goal, the goal that you desire, not my goal for you. And I totally get that growing up, we tend to set goals that are highly influenced by parents or teachers or others. But if you don't desire the goal, then those pathways and willpower. I'm reminded of a conversation I had a few years ago from some members of of the military, and it wasn't nefarious. It wasn't a nefarious conversation. It was interesting because hope in the context of positive psychology, for instance, there were some fairly rough times with regards to Guantanamo Bay and some of these aspects potentially being used to influence. I was asked whether or not hope could be used as an interrogation technique by those means, and I certainly have a sense that it could be manipulated in such a way to manipulate individuals towards actions or behaviors that I'm not overly comfortable with.
Yeah.
Well,
there are at least two other questions here that I'd like to get to. And I think one is explanatory. I mean, one is sort of just a little bit about the brain science that you mentioned earlier, and just asking to clarify and maybe explain in a little more detail what you described about willpower and the presence of glucose in the brain as a sort of measure of willpower, and this kind of, I guess, what would be an economic model of willpower, right? That it's like you have a certain amount and you can expend it, and once it's expended, all kinds of other things happen. Is it that simple? Do I just need to have more glucose in my brain, or?
Yeah, it's an interesting area of research. I would highly encourage your audience, to the extent that you're interested. There's the research part of it is Roy Baumeister out of Florida State University, the self-control, willpower kind of guru in the psychological world. But he has there was an article written up in the Atlantic, and it's titled something like the chocolate chip radish study, which really highlights this connection between glucose and willpower. So it turns out there's a relationship between glucose and willpower, and the experimental studies are basically getting glucose levels before the experimental condition, getting glucose levels after. In the treatment condition, the glucose level is depleted significantly, and then those two groups are compared in a goal pursuit activity. The depleted glucose individuals quit at a much higher rate. They quit earlier. They struggle with problem-solving activities. That's kind of the basis of some of that research. What's interesting about it, though, is it's struggling to account for these seemingly reserves that we have, because I can be completely emotionally exhausted and be in the context of fight, flight, or freeze and become very energetic, and so I think the jury's still out on all of that research, but I just find it really fascinating that there's multiple studies now showing that relationship between glucose and willpower. So
yeah, that's fascinating.
It is really interesting.
Let me see here. Oh, good. And we've just put a link in the chat for those who are interested to the chocolate and radish experiment from the Atlantic, if you want to take a look. So I know that one thing you mentioned earlier, I think it even came up in the chat at one point, and it maybe ties to some of the work that Titan does here at the University of Tulsa, is resilience. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between hope and resilience, and do you see resilience as one of the outcomes of hope? I mean, as you said earlier, hope is not the goal. Hope is there to kind of build create other kinds of outcomes. Is resilience one of those outcomes? Is there a correlation between hope and resilience?
Yeah, and so we actually have published a couple of pieces on this issue, and one of those just came out in Traumatology, in which we looked at hope and resilience as distinct contributors to well-being among child abuse survivors. And what we find, and we found these results very, very consistently, that hope tends to outperform resilience in the prediction of well-being. And just in case there are some psych folks or Titan, the measure we're using on resilience is the brief resilience scale. And so we tend to find this fairly consistently. I've replicated it with teachers. I've replicated it with child welfare workers and others. We do have a paper right now that is, I think, in a revise and resubmit. And I think it's traumatology, though it may be one of the other related journals, in which we actually find that in a panel or sort of a little bit more longitudinal type of design, what we find is that hope is actually a driver of resilience. So that and it sort of supports this idea that hope is the mindset that drives resilient behaviors. So it is this idea that we have to have a belief that the future can be better in order for us to endure, sustain, and potentially then overcome that adversity. So it's pretty new research for us, but I'm really intrigued by the difficulty is that in the trauma field, in the trauma work, resilience seems to be the go-to concept that we're all talking about. The difficulty is that there's really a lack of consensus on what resilience means. And so that's what we're trying to do in those publications and research, is sort of push that conversation about, if hope's a better predictor, why are we focused on resilience? And,
well, and I'll say, I mean, as a humanist, right, and somebody who's not a psychologist, and so not outside this field, and has, I think I probably think a bit differently about hope coming in tonight than I did when I'll leave this evening. I think one of the things that is so fascinating to me about your work and the talk that you've given this evening is that unlike resilience, hope seems like an immediately commonsensical, accessible concept, and you've broken it down into ways that that make it measurable and replicable, trainable, as you've suggested. But it seems a pretty easy concept to grasp, whereas resilience feels sort of second order or something. I mean, like you said, if you guys can't figure out quite what it means, those of us who are civilians have an even harder time, I think, trying to understand exactly what that means, other than, well, you should just be tough somehow, right? Whereas hope, I feel like in planning and willpower, I kind of get that as an immediately graspable concept.
Well, it's with the organizations and the therapists and the caseworkers who are doing trauma work. It's hope is an easy concept, because if they think about their program services, they all have goals, and their program services are in fact pathways to those goals. So it's easier for them to sort of recognize that the work that they do is centered around hope, right? And we know that from humanistic psychology, we know that from strengths-based perspective, that the relationships ought to be hope-inducing. You don't go to a therapist to hear like, yeah, it's going to kind of suck for you, so lean into it. You go because things could get better.
Well, and with that, we have one more comment here, and then I want to end this therefore with a question. And this I hope you find interesting. So this is from Elizabeth, who said, I was in rehab for 7 months in Tulsa, and we did the hope scale there. And we also, as a group, identified our light at the end of the tunnel. And it was really great in the process to see how everyone's hope increased by the time we left. And I should say every one of those sentences ended with an exclamation point, suggesting that this work really had an impact, for someone that needed it.
Well, and hey, I just have to say, what a great statement for courage, right? For going into and sustaining treatment takes tremendous amount of courage to change that craziness associated with addiction. So I certainly applaud whoever made that statement and applaud the courage that it took to do that. So,
in fact, we just had another follow-up that said we did similar exercises in another treatment program as well. So this work is clearly, happening on the ground here in Tulsa. And so perhaps as a final question, you mentioned a little bit of your own background there at the beginning. I would love to hear how you came. I mean, you describe yourself initially as a sort of stats person, and I'm fascinated about how you came to settle on hope as a sort of research project that's clearly going to consume probably the rest of your career at this point, given all the research and work that you're discussing here. And it does seem a little bit of a distance away from being the stats guy in a psych department. So tell us, I wonder if you could just tell us how you came to the idea of hope.
Sure. So, when I finally navigated college as an undergraduate and really leaned into the idea that I wanted to be a professor, and, that psychology, it was interesting that I chose psychology, but I avoided the counseling and clinical side, given my background. And I mean, honestly, it was really like, yeah, that stuff happened. It was over there. I'm going to move forward. And statistics just really came fairly naturally to me. And I think when I came to OU, I was immediately drawn by the work that is going on in our community in domestic violence and child maltreatment. I was just really intrigued by that work, not so much from the psychological impact on clients, but just that more from an organizational perspective of individuals who would day in and day out immerse themselves in the trauma and adversity of others. And that sort of for the greater humanity kind of thing, really hats off. I mean, that's amazing work. And that's really where I stumbled into it, in the conversation with a young man who was facing all kinds of adversity, but was still future focused. His adversity wasn't defining him in that moment. And I found that intriguing. And then once I recognized it as hope, it really just allowed me to really further explore my own personal experiences. And, I think all of us are just trying to figure it all out. And I'm honored to be a professor where I can study other people to figure myself out. And this is my experience. How does it impact others? And it's been what I do as a professor is a pure hobby. We have the best jobs in the world.
I heartily second that, actually. Well, Professor Hellman, I want to thank you very much. This was a terrific and enlightening evening. I learned a great deal. I think we had a terrific conversation going on here in the chat as well. The work that you're doing seems important and exciting. And we're certainly, I mean, I could say as a member of the Tulsa community, I'm certainly grateful for the ways that the work that you're doing is rooted right here in the community and making such a difference here in Tulsa. So I'm grateful for that as well. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight as well. As I said, I know there were many, many other demands on your attention this evening, but this was also probably a great moment for us all to take a step back and to think about the value of hope, not just in relationship to one single event like the elections or COVID, but really as a kind of, as Professor Hellman has suggested, a way of orienting ourselves to the world and to all of its complexities and challenges. So thank you all for joining us. I want to remind you that we'll host an event again next week at 7 o'clock on watching Watchmen in the context of the race massacre centenary here in Tulsa. So Professor Hellman, thank you once again. We are all applauding, though you cannot see it. I want to thank you for visiting the University of Tulsa this evening and thank all of you. I hope you have a good night. I hope you take care of yourselves and of your community.